Silence, please. We are going to start it. Please take your seat. Please take your seat and be silent. So, good evening, my students. Thank you very much for coming for my fourth lecture of making students to entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of India to unicorn. On behalf of the country India, I'd like to welcome all our students from Netherlands, the business school. India is a great country to explore opportunities of linkage, not only in your student exchange program, but also see how you can link it to the businesses. The objective of lectures are to see that how we will convert. Excuse me, madam. Please, hello. Please silence, please. The objective of the session is to motivate students to become entrepreneurs of and how entrepreneurs can help students in motivating them to upskill them. The motive of this session is also to elevate entrepreneurs to unicorn. This lecture is happen every Friday, 5:30 to 6:30, and so we started from 1st of January 2020. And very happy to inform you that we have identified three students who are already doing businesses in Delhi, which motivate us to scale it to something like 1,000 student entrepreneurs by 31st December 2020. I am very thankful to Shriram College of Commerce, Miranda College, Deshbandhu Gupta College, IIT Delhi, IIT Kanpur in supporting it. And my request to our foreign partners are that how you can FICCI is a large federation house in which we represent large industries of India. We have close to about 300,000 industries of India. The room which you are sitting represent 300,000 industries of India. The large, small, medium startups, informal, non-farm sectors, agri sector, everything. And India is rising on the top. We will be a $10 trillion economy, 10 trillion by 2030. And how you can harness this potential at this age is an opportunity for each student who want to become an entrepreneur. Today, we have a living God to me and my mentor, respected Mr. Vijay Mahajan. He is known in the world, not in India, as a job creator, as a livelihood creator. Recently, the government of US has honored him as one of the best awards in financial inclusion sector in the world. He has created an employment opportunity for 3 million hearts in India, in the world. He represents many institutions, but today he is serving our nation. He is a president or CEO of Rajiv Gandhi Foundation and a senior advisor to Mr. Rahul Gandhi. But he oversees and mentor FICCI a lot. His passion is social enterprise, and he's a best guide you can ever see. I'm very sure that once you listen to him, you follow him on the Facebook, online, difficult to meet him, thankful to him that he has spared his 1 hour for the students of Delhi and for FICCI. I give to my mentor, Mr. Vijay Mahajanji, to kindly motivate our students to become entrepreneurs and how Basix, how your institutions, how FICCI, how Rajiv Gandhi Foundation can help students to elevate and taking India on the upskill pride.
Well, thank you, Nirankar, and thank you, Raman. And friends, students from both Delhi University. I believe there are people here from both SRCC and Miranda. And the people from the Netherlands are from the Utrecht Business School. Welcome, ma'am. So, uh, so I'm very happy to be here and share the next hour or so with you. But I think the best way to deal with that is not for me to give you a long lecture. I will certainly speak for about 10, 15 minutes just to give you a context. But thereafter, we will keep it for Q&A. But just so that Q&A doesn't go random. I'd sort of, if somebody is asking a question, then we'll ask whether there are two or three other questions related to that, so that we can deal with a cluster of questions. Otherwise, Q&A can become very, if any of your physicists, what's called Brownian motion, going tuck, 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 like that. Anyway, so uh, let's first be conscious of where we are in time and space. It's very important to remember that we are in 2020, and we are in a very advanced stage of the human civilization. Obviously, we will be much more advancement, but even compared to just, in case of India, just 50 years ago, and as compared to Europe, say 100 years ago, there's been such a tremendous change, and that in terms of things that humanity can do, it's quite amazing. My first degree is in technology. I'm a graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and in electronics. And by the way, my first job was with Philips, which is a well-known Dutch electronics multinational. So those of you who are from Netherlands would know that. And at least in that one field, but in several other fields. But when I was in IIT, there were only 5 institutions in India which had computers. I'm talking of the early 70s. And we had a computer with 16 kilobytes of memory. Each of it was divided into 4 racks of memory. Each rack was the size of a Godrej cupboard. In India, we have a brand of cupboards, metal cupboards called Godrej. And and it was in a big room of this size, and it was seriously air conditioned because it produced a lot of heat. Today, in my pocket, I carry this little thing. All of you carry probably much more sophisticated models, but typically you have 16 gigabytes of memory. So kilo and giga, kilo is 10 to the power of 3, giga is 10 to the power of 12. So a billion times more you're carrying in your pocket what used to fill up a room like this. And in terms of speed as well, and in terms of connectivity as well, everything is in orders of magnitude. And that's just one field, one discipline. I was lucky enough to have studied the building block principles of what makes this device work, both in terms of its electronics and its software. So I still understand it. But every time I try to tell my son and daughter, do you know what a huge packaging of thousands of inventions this is? And the eyes roll over and say, Dad, don't start again. Yeah. Your generation created all this. But the fact is that, we've, in the 20th century, we created a lot of such technologies which have addressed a lot of human needs and beyond our needs. And that's equally true in biology. Biotechnology barely existed. I mean, the genetic code was, DNA as a molecule was just discovered only in the 50s, and by the time the genetic code was better understood, it was already the late 80s. The human genome was sequenced only less than 20 years ago for the first time. And the first time it cost $1 billion. Now, using CRISPR technology, you can sequence the human genome for about $300, and they're planning to get it down to about $30. Okay, so so that's all. This is wonderful, and I'm sure each of you can identify and recall many such advances. But at the same time, the 20th century also has left us with a, many severe problems. There are thousands, but let me talk about the three big clusters of problems. And in a sense, I'm looking forward to your generation addressing those problems, not just as inventors or technologists, not just as business people, but as really problem solvers, but in an entrepreneurial way. So, and I'll explain why being entrepreneurial is very important. So, first of all, the three clusters of problems are: one is that in the process of fulfilling our needs and going well beyond that, and in a sense, fulfilling a large number of our desires, we become so obsessed with material needs and material advancement that we've neglected a lot of our other aspects of human existence. And as a result, while we may have a lot of material progress, we also have simultaneously a lot of inner tensions, a lot of family tensions, a lot of societal tensions. So, basically, our ability to deal with ourselves has not grown in proportion to our ability to deal with the material world. You know, so that's a central problem, and that shows up in various ways. There's a epidemic of depressive diseases. There's an epidemic of sort of intolerance, etc., etc. And this is equally true in highly advanced societies. It's true at the higher end of the income ladder, uh, and so it's a paradox that while trying to maximize material utility, we've actually, when to use economics language, we've fallen well beyond the even the satisficing level of overall utility, overall happiness. And that's a central problem. It needs to be addressed by your generation. The second is we've not progressed much in learning how to deal with each other. So while connectivity has dramatically enabled us to peep into each other's lives and become seriously aware of differences, you know, differences in terms of lifestyle, differences in terms of levels of income, ways of eating, dressing, talking, behaving, all of that. Connectivity has not translated into connectedness, you know. And if anything, this sort of superficial familiarity with the other has brought with it an enhanced xenophobia. So there's a tendency to say, oh, you're not like me, and therefore I don't understand you, and therefore you may you may be dangerous. I'm afraid of you, or I certainly don't want to deal with you. And if I'm forced in a situation where I have to compete with you, I start with negative attitudes towards that person who's not like me. And that may be in any attribute. It may be race, it may be gender, it may be religion, it may be linguistic, it may be sexual orientation. There are so many ways to to look at the other. So the first set of problems is how to deal with self and find meaning in this life. Second is how to deal with others, other human beings, and eventually arrive at a more harmonious way of living together. Because despite several attempts at, and the extreme examples of that are things like ethnic cleansing, where lots of deaths have also happened, killing has happened. But short of that, there's all types of separations. in Delhi, those of you who live in Delhi, this whole concept of gated communities. Almost every area of Delhi, the lanes get locked at night, because there's this fear of the outsider. Uh, there's increasing differentiation, not just on the basis of income, but on many other things. At least the last, which is extremely dangerous, is on the basis of religion and so forth. So we have to deal with all of this. Uh, and the third cluster of problems is dealing with our place in nature. You know, the Homo sapiens have been so successful in dealing with the material world that they started believing in this myth that actually creation was meant for man, you know, and that nature is really there only to fulfill our needs. And that led to rampant exploitation of natural resources and of causing, pollution and shortages of all kinds. So, I mean, just one example, and you're in Delhi, so you don't have to go very far. The capital cities of the two most populous countries in the world, Beijing and Delhi, have at least 100 days a year each when the air quality is far above hazardous. So, if you were from Mars, you'd say, hey, what kind of civilization is this? That the so called largest countries and among the top 5 economies in the world, they're capital cities where tens of millions of people live. They are not able to have a basic good called clean air. Something doesn't make sense, right? I mean, and then on top of that, in India, we insist on calling ourselves smart cities, which is such a joke. We're the dumbest possible thing if you can't even breathe in a city, right? So, so I'm the same guy who a few minutes ago extolled the virtues of technology and told you what a great gift you got in terms of the mobile phone and biotechnology and all that. But basically, it's also created these incredible mega problems, which are clustered into these three. You can, of course, parse them. You'll find many, many sub problems. So, so the challenge to your generation is to address these problems in a manner where you come out with your feet on the ground, and not just you individually, but humanity as a collective. Okay? And so, so whether it's dealing with climate change, or whether it's dealing with spread of social violence, whether it's terrorism or domestic violence, or whether it's dealing with the spread of depression or meaninglessness, alienation, we have to, it's your generation which will have to deal with this. Now, you can say, hey, hold it. I came here to learn about entrepreneurship. Nice to know all this. So where does this fit? So the second big point that I want to make is that another characteristic of the 20th century was that we all reposed a lot of faith in this entity that we created together over several centuries called the nation state. Okay? It was created largely in Europe, but then the idea spread, and we're all now organized as nation states. 193 are United Nations members, some big, some small, but there are at least 30, 40 major nation states with, 100 million or more people and, stuff like that. And whether it was the communist nations, where the state was basically a provider of everything, owner of everything, or whether it was European economies, which are largely, based on a socialistic way of thinking, where the state provided basic services in a very big way: health, education, significant amounts of employment, social security, or whether it was so-called capitalist economies like the United States. But actually, think about the operating structure of the United States. There's a huge role of the state all the way from the 1930s, when, after the Depression, the U.S. government pretty much built out the economy by building first the highway system, and then, of course, the war came and the war economy and so on. But as recently as 1974, the United States of America, so-called capitalist free market economy, had a bureau for costs and prices. As recently as 1970, it was finally dismantled in 1974. So so it's a myth to say that central planning and price controls were only done in the Soviet Union. They were certainly done in Europe, and they were done even in capitalistic economies. And then that was dismantled slowly. The communist states pretty much broke down. The leftover major communist state, China, decided to adopt, a hybrid system with this sort of market capitalism, but with the state as playing a major role. And both Europe, particularly Britain, and the US, particularly under Prime Minister Thatcher in UK and President Reagan in Europe, became increasingly more market oriented. And so, starting roughly 1980s, we saw a toning down of the role of the state and an increased role of the market. And things like railway transportation services, water supply, which were always seen to be the role of the state, got privatized in country after country. Uh, uh, the US never had a national or state supported health system, and they continue to rely on a private sector system. So it reached a point where, in the end of the 20th century, people had this belief: okay, there is a state, it has to play some role, mainly law and order, defense, macroeconomic policy, and so forth. But then, rest of it has to be done by business. Okay, but it was still big business. And in all of this, what was forgotten was that eventually most of us are organized in our day to day work in relatively small settings. You know, so whether we work in small businesses, or whether we use small shops, or we work on small farms, we are basically dealing with rather large number of rather tiny entities. Even in the most advanced economy, not more than a third of the workforce works for large corporations. In a place like India, 93% of people work for the so-called informal sector or the agriculture sector. About 45% work in the agriculture sector. Our average small farm is less than 2.5 acres. You know, likewise, we have 60 million micro enterprises, typically 1 to 2 workers. That's very similar structure in China, Indonesia, Brazil. Less so, particularly in the eastern and western seaboard of the United States. But when you come to major part of the US itself, it's again the same story. So if that is the real structure of the economy, then actually neither the state nor big business is the answer. And we have to rediscover entrepreneurship, because that's where we have to sort of address the issue of livelihoods. On the one hand, we have sort of, particularly in India and in Africa, an increasingly young population looking for work. There are no significant jobs to be had. India needs to generate, for example, about 12 million jobs per annum because of the increase in the labor force demographically. The private sector and the government sector, the state sector and the private sector, organized private sector, have never generated more than 4 million jobs out of that 12 million that we need. The rest basically have to be in the self-employment sector. Okay. And if it is self-employment, then you have to be entrepreneurial. Okay. So when we say entrepreneurial, while you did mention that you would like to promote, what you call unicorns, which is basically an entity which becomes $1 billion in market capitalization. But, you know, all the unicorns of the world will not be able to employ even 1 year's incremental employment needs of just India. Forget about Indonesia and Nigeria and, the African continent and Latin America. So the answer has to be in much smaller startups. Of course, the law of large numbers applies, and many of them will become larger, and hopefully some of them will become unicorns. But in a fascination and admiration for the Googles and the Amazons of this world, or in India the Paytms and the Flipkarts, we should not forget that over 90% of our workforce, basically finds its livelihoods in small farms, in small businesses, in micro enterprises. And this generation has to deal with those big three clusters of problems using this structure of the economy. There's no magic wand where all of this economy will suddenly get Googleized or Amazonized. Okay. And so what it means is, starting with self, to go back to the three clusters of problems, starting with self, we have to stop depending on the big daddy called the state or the other big daddy called the corporation. Okay. And we have to start becoming much more sort of self-driven, self-reliant, and which doesn't mean just individually. It can be small clusters of people working together. And that means, of course, finding local markets, finding resources, startup businesses, finding the experience, the inputs, the technologies, putting it all together. So that's the stuff of entrepreneurship. Okay. And in that, there are basically three, and this is the last point I want to make, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. The original French word entrepreneur basically means someone who puts things together. Coordinator is the closest you have in English to that. So somebody who puts what together? Puts basically a demand for any goods or services and the supply for that together in an organized way such that it is long-term, sustainable, makes profits, generates a return. Now, that means doing thousands of things. But again, there are three clusters of things that you have to deal with. First is you have to clearly identify what is the demand for. You have to start. You can't be an entrepreneur without thinking about the demand side. Sometimes the demand may be latent. For example, before the mobile phone came, nobody knew that there'd be a demand for 1.2 billion or 1.3 billion handsets or mobile telecoms services that will be needed. But the underlying demand was the need to telecommunicate. That is, to be able to talk to and communicate with people who are not within proximate distance. And then this device came to meet that. So you have to start from demand side. You can't start from what I can make. The second is, once the demand is kind of understood, or a cluster of demand that you can handle, then the technology as well as the business skills for that you will need to put it all together. And that can be highly sophisticated technologies, or it can be off-the-shelf available technologies, or it can even be traditional handicraft type of technologies.